The sea keeps its oldest stories in the dark, and the story that emerged from the rusting skeleton of RMS Titanic was one the ocean had kept for a very long time. What began as a routine archaeological survey, a careful mapping of the ship's remaining architecture, mosaics of collapsed cabins, and the slow accumulation of century-old detritus became, within the space of a single descent, an encounter with life forms that blurred the line between myth and taxonomy. The remoteness of the site, nearly 4 miles beneath the Atlantic's surface, lent the discovery an almost ceremonial hush. A place where pressure, cold, and time conspire to preserve the extraordinary. Remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, threaded their way through a landscape of collapsed stairwells and portholes, their lights thinly slicing through 3,800 meters of black water. The feeds were monitored by a circle of researchers, the low hum of compressors and the tap of keyboards, mixing with the whispered names of shipboard relics. For weeks, the team recorded expected life, squat lobsters clustered like punctuation. Around beams, brittle stars flaring like fragile inked fingers, and the slow accretion of manganese nodules along tilted bulkheads. Then, on the 19th descent, the cameras caught movement that did not match any known behavior. The first indicator was scale. A shadow glided across the ROV's floodlight, and when the beam reached it, the silhouette resolved into a coiled mass longer than the bow section itself. Its skin caught the light with a sheen like oil-slicked metal, and the body bore a pattern of faint, concentric ridges. No known deep-sea cephalopod or baleen whale fit the size or morphology. The creature's head, if head it had, bore paired, symmetrically placed orifices that glowed with a soft, bluish biofluorescence. Tentacular appendages, thick as tree trunks, curled and uncurled with a careful deliberation that suggested intelligence rather than reflex. The team named the largest specimen informally, after a phrase in the ship's manifest, Leviathanus titanicus. Such a name, they were careful to stress, was provisional. Taxonomists would later assign a binomial. Only after a rigorous process of morphological analysis and molecular sequencing. Yet the moniker captured a truth the cameras could not disguise. Here, in the shadow of one of the 20th century's greatest human tragedies, swam creatures of a scale that realigned the scientists' expectations of the deep. Subsequent dives revealed that the Titanic's hull had become more than a historical relic. It was an ecological nucleus. The wreck's vertical surfaces created currents and microhabitats that drew prey and, in turn, predators. Smaller members of the newly documented clade, juveniles or related species, took shelter within collapsed cabins, their skin patterned in camouflaged mosaics to match the flaking paint and rust. ROV manipulator arms recovered samples of tissue encased in a thin layer of mineralization. Those samples, once thawed and preserved, yielded cellular structures unlike any cataloged species. Collagen-like fibers arranged in quasi-laminar sheets, and pigment organelles with spectral properties that suggested light production optimized for the abyssal wavelengths common at these depths. Behavioral observations were perhaps the most arresting. Leviathanus and its kin displayed both ambush strategies and social complexity. On more than one occasion, multiple individuals coordinated movements that shunted loose debris and created temporary currents, driving schools of small, silvery amphipods into confined zones for easy feeding. One raw ascent captured what scientists described as a ritualistic display. 2 large adults entwined above the roped remains of a turret, their bodies aflame with faint phosphorescent bands. The display culminated in a slow, graceful separation, and the release of a cloud of bioluminescent mucus, a feeding cloud that briefly illuminated the wreck like a cathedral in stained glass. The discovery forced a re-examination of long-held assumptions about deep-sea gigantism. Traditional hypotheses linked the phenomenon to cold temperatures, low predation pressure, and oxygen-rich currents. Yet Leviathan's anatomy, hinted at additional drivers. Its musculature was adapted for long, energy-efficient glides rather than explosive bursts. A lattice of hollow channels beneath the dermis carried symbiotic bacteria, and preliminary genomic sequencing from tissue samples suggested an unusual metabolic partnership, chemosynthetic microbes that could supplement the creature's caloric needs by processing trace metals leached from the ship's corroding hull. In essence, the wreck had become a platform for an ecosystem that had learned to harvest the byproducts of human industry. The find also raised questions of time and evolution. Radiocarbon assays of calcified barnacle-like encrustations on the then creature's flanks indicated that at least some individuals had been attached to the wreck for decades. Were these species long-established denizens of the abyss that opportunistically colonized the Titanic when new niches opened? Or had the ship, with its sudden introduction of iron and artificial structure, catalyzed a rapid local adaptation? Pollen-sized spores and microplastics embedded in the mucus suggested a more recent interaction with surface-derived material. The deep ocean, it seems, is not as insulated from human influence as once imagined. Field notes from the expedition read like a ledger of astonishment. In one entry, a technician described the sound the creatures made when passing close to the ROV's hydrophones, a rolling low-frequency oscillation that matched acoustic signatures associated with baleen whales, yet modulated in a pattern more complex than simple calls. Another entry recorded the reaction of a juvenile specimen to a thermal gradient created by the ROV's lights, a tentative, probing movement that suggested learned curiosity rather than instinctive fear. These observations extended the ethical considerations of deep-sea research. When the subject of study demonstrates cognition and sociality, the line between observation and intrusion narrows. The team's announcement of the discovery was circumspect. They shared high-resolution imagery and sample data with the broader scientific community, urging caution against sensationalism. The wreck is a protected site, and the presence of unique biological assemblages added another layer to the legal and moral framework surrounding its stewardship. Conservationists argued for restricted access and for research that prioritized non-invasive observation. Others, mindful of the potential scientific payoff, advocated for carefully controlled sampling. The debate was not merely bureaucratic. It reflected a broader rethinking of the deep sea as a living archive, where wrecks and other anthropogenic structures are agents of biological change. Beyond the science, the discovery stirred something more elemental in the public imagination. The Titanic has always carried an aura of myth, and the notion that her submerged remains had become a cradle for creatures large enough to evoke ancient sea stories resonated across cultures. Documentaries framed the Leviathaness not as a monster, but as a new protagonist in the ocean's ongoing drama, a reminder that human histories are now braided with natural histories in ways that are irreversible and often surprising. As research continues, the work is necessarily slow and deliberate. Deep-sea expeditions are logistically demanding, and the ethics of interacting with sentient, long-lived organisms require that the scientific community proceed with humility. For now, the footage circulates as visitation without touch, a visual testament to an ecosystem that adapted around an artifact of human tragedy. The Titanic, a ship that once represented the pinnacle of human engineering, now anchors a tableau where evolution and human legacy interlock. In the end, the discovery at Titanic is less a final chapter than an opening, an invitation to reconsider the ocean's depth, not as a void, but as a theater of complex life, much of it only now coming into relief. The colossal animals that dwell among the rusting turrets remind us that the sea keeps what we leave beneath its surface, gives it new purpose, and in doing so, writes new stories that future generations will read with the same mixture of reverence and awe as we now read the cable-laced recordings of that first astonishing descent.